have a better understanding of that. Some of you get exposed to that, you know, if you have problems with a particular project in your area anyway, but this will give the whole board exposure to that. So we're excited about it. Chris is excited about it, and come on up. Some of you get
Chairman Fox basically took all my comments. Just my whole role was to introduce the topic and introduce the series. I think we're calling it Highways 101. We couldn't think of a better name for it, but really we're going to try to walk you through project inception and then all the way to maintenance and operations. And so the first two, who's dropping? Again, this is just a graphic. This sort of depicts the main topics that we want to cover here. In the center of the graphic, you see project life cycle. And you see all the four major things that are going to get addressed. The project delivery piece is going to be addressed in the first two sessions. So that'll be real heavy today. And then I think next month we're coming back. And then we move into a topic that's very near and dear to the chairman's heart, and is also something that I like to talk about. And several of you have had questions about various aspects of it in the past, but project delivery types and like procurement types. So we're going to do a deep dive on that. We're going to talk about contract administration and how that works, project inspection. All those things will be touched on in the next four sessions of the series. And then we'll get into a couple of sessions late in the year about maintenance and operations. Again, I covered the slide pretty well, I think. I don't believe I missed anything. Again,
that's not the typical road.
No. And I don't even think that's our road. Yeah. I think that's the Park Service maintains that. But Megan should be very familiar with it, right? Yeah. Again, this slide just sort of reiterates what I've been telling you of what we're going to try to cover today. We got a handful of staff here that are experts, or either are managing a group of experts that are very integral in getting a project from an idea to getting it on a piece of paper so we can all look at it and get stakeholder feedback and figure out how we're going to progress that project into something that moves goods, services, and people for the state of North Carolina. This is just a background slide. I hope all of you know these statistics already, but it's just a reminder of how big our system is. We're the second largest in the country behind Texas for state maintained highway system. Successful project delivery can incorporate up to 28 disciplines and over 100 pre-construction activities, so when you think of that in its enormity, it is a big deal. And that's why we have a staff as large as we do, and why we need so many partners to help us deliver our program. So Matt, are you coming? So I think you all know Matt Clark. He's our Director of Technical Services. And so he's going to kick off the next phase of this conversation. I think if you guys have like really deep dive concepts that we need to explore further, because some of this stuff is going to lead to some very good questions from you. I'm almost 100% sure of it. I think we can use some of the committees at future board meetings to go deep dive on, exploring a certain topic and getting a little more detail if you guys have that desire. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it's good afternoon. I am Matt Clark, Director of Technical Services. You don't hear that term very often, but technical services consists of 10 business units focused mainly on pre-construction activities. And you're going to hear from two of the managers today that are leading units in technical services. You'll hear from Pat Ivey, Division Engineer, Division 9, Lee Wing as the Deputy Director of Planning and Programming, Jennifer Evans, Manager of the Project Management Unit, and John Jameson, Manager of the Environmental Policy Unit. As Chief Operating Officer, people share.
It's good to give y'all a heads up about the slide. I wanted to see
we're gonna start at the top left and slowly work through this whole chart. No. Today and the next work session, we'll be focusing at a very high level on pre-construction activities that the department completes. And we'll be discussing today the collaboration that NCDOT has and the activities that we complete from the time when a transportation need is identified in long-range planning, how the need is prioritized and becomes a project, and then steps necessary in project planning to satisfy environmental requirements and begin the project design. All of these efforts are focused on delivering a project that meets the purpose and need based on the local input and the transportation data that we have. This is just a very general backdrop of the activities that may be necessary to complete a pre-construction project. We're not going to be going into detail. As you can see, what we're seeing here can be years worth of work for us to be successful in delivering a construction project. You'll hear the speakers refer to the project delivery network or the PDN or different stages. This is what they're referring to. We're happy to go into detail, but hopefully you'll never need to know much more than this. As you drill down into this document, it's really a framework that identifies the activities, tasks, responsibilities, and the deliverables of pre-construction disciplines. It's flexible, even though it looks rigid, it's flexible to meet the needs of many different sizes of transportation projects. Drilling it down to very basics, looking across the 4 stages of the project delivery network, we see this summary here. And today we're going to be focusing on stage 1 and stage 2. Stage 1 being project initiation, projects being funded and entering the STIP. And then stage 2 is where the department defines the alignment of the transportation facility. And this consists of doing completing the environmental analysis, the initial design, utility coordination, and early right-of-way activities. So I'll invite Mr. Pat Ivey to continue on for us.
Thank you, Matt. Again, I am Pat Ivey, the Division 9 engineer in Winston-Salem, and I think you'll appreciate my presentation all the more after we've heard seen those slides about the whole process that we go through. So planning, prioritizing, and programming, as you've heard before, the whole purpose of the STIP is about addressing transportation problems in North Carolina. And of course, planning, prioritizing, and programming is step 1 in that process. So you might think, why is the division engineer talking about the planning process? Well, I hope after you see the next 6 slides, you'll see how deeply ingrained the divisions and the board are very much involved in that process. So let's move ahead. The first step, of course, is long-range transportation planning. And I wanted to focus on really the 3 key planning documents involved in the transportation planning process. First of all is the Comprehensive Transportation Plan, or the CTP. This is a long-range document, 25 to 30 years, that are basically at a county level. And they are not fiscally constrained, and they basically represent the needs of the community over that horizon years. I'll talk about a little bit more in detail in the next slide. But the next thing is the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, or MTP. These are for MPOs only. These are fiscally constrained, and they cover over a 25 to 30 year horizon period. And then lastly, as you all know, the State Transportation Improvement Program, or the STIP. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Of course, that represents all of our funded projects, and it is a 10-year horizon. It also must be fiscally constrained. One thing that's very important is that both the MTP and the STIP need to be compatible. They need to basically be in agreement with each other. And that is why it's important to have a good working relationship between the divisions and the MPOs. And it's also another good reason why it's so important for board member participation in the MPO meetings, because that's really a critical part of this process. And as you all know, you need to be involved and be aware of what's going on in the MPOs. So let's drill down a little bit deeper and talk about the CTPs, or the Comprehensive Transportation Plans. Now, the CTPs, they are a statutorily driven needs-based plan that represents the community's consensus on their future transportation system to support anticipated growth and development over, as I said, the next 25 to 30 years. It is a multimodal program, taking into consideration highways, public transportation, rail, bike, and ped. It also involves a robust technical analysis, as you can see here, including things like deficiency and congestion analyses, bridge and crash locations, population growth, land use, development plans, environmental screening, very important there, existing multimodal and community plans, and it takes into consideration environmental justice, equity, and Title VI assessments. This is also a very public process involving all of our local agencies, stakeholders, and the community. They are all very much involved in the development of the comprehensive transportation plans. And then lastly, they provide useful information in project initiation and development, such as project proposals, including the following: identified need and supporting data, description and context of the projects, studied planning level alternatives, public and agency involvement and comments, community information, project history, and the like. So let's talk about the STIP. Most of you have been very much involved with that. So this again is a very high level look at the STIP. It's a lot more involved with it. So, and bottom line is, it's a 10-year planning document for our capital program. The four main components are the capital projects themselves, meaning their scope of work. What does the project do? Along with an estimate of their schedule and cost, and then the budget we have to work within based on our anticipated state and federal revenues. So we'll touch base on and talk about all four of those areas as we walk through the project development process together. So STIP funding distribution. Many of you all have seen this, and hopefully this is a reminder slide for many of you, but if you're not, of course, the funding distribution is divided into three different areas. First is statewide mobility, which represents 40% of the total funding. Program first out of that category, as you see here, is interstate maintenance projects, bridge replacement, bridge rehabilitation, and highway safety. Then, of course, the next level is regional impact. That represents 30% of the total funding, and this is based on the percent of the overall state population in these specific funding regions. And as you can see here with the 7 buckets, there are 7 different funding regions across the state. Program first out of that category is bridge replacement, bridge rehabilitation, and highway safety. And then, of course, the last bucket is division needs, which represents the last 30% of the total funding. And it is basically an equal share among the 14 transportation divisions. And of course, you see here, program first, again, bridge replacement, bridge rehabilitation, highway safety, MPOs, the direct attributable, that DA funding that the MPOs get on an annual basis. Transportation alternatives, highway rail crossings, and economic development. So let's talk a little bit about the scoring process. First of all, the projects are submitted by MPOs, RPOs, and by the divisions. They're all submitted online for a spot review. Each are reviewed for category eligibility. The data is screened, and then the quantitative scores are calculated. So depending on which category, let's start with statewide mobility. First of all, this statewide mobility is the score is based 100% on the quantitative score. In other words, there are no local input points assigned to these projects. The projects are programmed, and any projects in the statewide category that are not programmed cascade into the next category, which is regional impact. That, again, as we said before, represents 30% of the total funding. On this one, local input points are assigned. 70% of the score is the quantitative or data-driven score, and 30% is local input through the local input points, divided equally between the planning organizations and the divisions. And local input points are assigned, the total scores are calculated, projects are programmed based on that score, and any project that is not programmed is cascaded into the next category, which, as you see here, is the division needs category, again, representing 30% of the total funding available. That is 50% of the score is based on the quantitative score, and 50% is local input points, again, divided equally between the planning organizations and the divisions. So local input points are assigned, total scores are calculated, and then those projects are programmed. And as you know, there's a lot more projects out there that need to be programmed that do not get into the TIP. And my last slide here, which I think really is probably the most important. While MPOs and RPOs have a statutory role in the prioritization process, this should not diminish the importance of the division and the board members' role in the process. The divisions have the responsibility of balancing the needs of the entire division, whereas MPOs and RPOs look at a very compact area. But we look at the entire division as opposed to those needs of the individual MPOs and RPOs. We're also involved, as you can see here, in the initial project submittals, as I said before, the assignment of local input points, working directly with planning organizations to maximize submittals, and more importantly, to avoid duplicate submittals. Very important when you only have a certain number of projects you can send in. Effective working relationships between the divisions and the planning organizations is critical, and the division engineer and our staff, we're the ones, we help make that happen in the field. And then, of course, our corridor development engineers, which were required by the legislature, have really helped. I know in Division 9, have really helped those planning organizations work through that process. So, Lee?
Thank you, Pat. So I'm going to take us, he had early stage one, so I'm going to take us into stage one, which is project initiation and scoping. And I know we're kind of pressed for time, so I'm going to sort of go through this a little bit quickly to make sure that we have time for Jennifer and John after I speak. So when we talk about project initiation and scoping, what we're talking about is, Pat talked about how there are these long-range transportation plans where there have been identified needs. We have an issue here. We have a need, a transportation need that has been identified in these plans. And so what we're trying to do here is go ahead and start initiating that scoping in that project to get going. Because we're going to eventually have a design set of plans that we need to get going on something before we go all the way there. So this is the stage one where we're trying to determine what are our project goals in initiating that transportation need and that issue. What are some viable alternatives and some conceptual designs and some alternatives that we can come up with to to address that identified need. And so also during this, we're going to be able to screen out some alternatives that may not be viable for addressing that based on what those project goals are. Certainly we'll be working with our locals on that, of course. And then maybe start identifying some fatal flaws or some issues we may be encountering as we go through the project development phase. And of course, always we want to try to develop a better cost estimate. So we're accomplishing this project initiation and scoping in two phases. The first phase being that express design evaluation. I think you've heard us talk a little bit about that before. Express design doesn't mean that it's happening, in 5 minutes or anything, but it's not a full-blown design, but it is we're obviously putting some engineering eyes on what these alternatives are, and we're coming up with some conceptual designs, some quantities, some early cost estimates, working with our stakeholders, of course, to make sure that we are adjusting it in a way that, meets their needs. And so then we're going through the prioritization process that Pat just walked you through. And so we're getting that better scope and estimate as we're going through prioritization and scoring these projects. And then we're moving on to the project scoping report, doing a little bit more of that initial environmental screening, pulling all of that data together that's been worked on into a package to hand off to our project development engineers as they get started. This helps them get that jump start so that they're not starting from ground zero, from scratch. They don't know what's out there. We're saying, hey, here's some initial information on what we're dealing with, some alternatives that we've come up with, some costs, some estimates, and some early design work so that you're not, like I said, not starting on it cold. So we wanted to kind of do a checklist of what is the project initiation scoping process? What does it entail? So very, like I said, it's that initial step of planning and design for candidate projects. We're trying to lay out and describe exactly what we plan to do with that project, sort of honing in on that scope, getting some estimates for preliminary cost, and again, identifying maybe some potential problems that may arise as we're trying to address that need, and then investigate some conceptual designs and costs as it's going through prioritization. And I like this little bullet down here at the bottom. It's an alternative. It's not necessarily the alternative. That's going to get established later on through the process. I think Jennifer and John will probably touch on that as well. It's just, again, it's super early initial, not necessarily honing on the exact alternative, but it is an alternative. And then what is it not? It's not detailed engineering. You know, we're not getting that final set of plans. You know, we're not doing in-depth collection of field studies. We're doing some initial preliminary environmental screening. And then NEPA-SEPA, that's that Environmental Protection Act that we have to follow to make sure we're not accomplishing that fully, but we are getting some information that's going to help feed that when they start going down the path of doing that required environmental document. So some of the additional features, just a list here of things that are getting provided to project development staff through the express designs and project scoping. We're getting some mapping limits for our photogrammetry and surveying folks. You know, we certainly need to start having those conversations on constructability and maintenance of traffic issues. You don't want to start having those conversations too late because you may find out that one of those alternatives really wasn't viable once you start having those conversations. So having those early, doing some initial hydraulic review, like I said, environmental screening. We're going to go ahead and initiate the crash analysis data. And then this last one, I'm going to have a couple of slides on this EDTE, Express Design Traffic Evaluation. We're going to start doing a preliminary traffic analysis. So similar to how I'm saying here that we're doing an express design, that initial early conceptual design, a new idea has kind of come about on traffic evaluations. We certainly need a full-blown traffic evaluation to be done for a final design, but it doesn't really need to be done this early. So this topic or this idea of express design traffic evaluation came to fruition. And so what it's doing is we're utilizing some simplified traffic volume development methods to kind of figure out what those estimates are out there so that when we're putting together an alternative, we're knowing that it's really going to meet the project needs and accomplish that goal out there. And so going to help for better coordination, design, and cost estimates. We harp on that a lot. We're working to make sure that we're honing in on those as well. And so these experts that are putting this together are going to kind of help the decision makers make sure that the alternatives that they're working towards are really going to fit their needs. So our EDTEs, Express Design Traffic Evaluation, is important. You can see that here. It's going to make sure that the alternative and the design is going to operate at a level that's commensurate with what those project goals were that were set out in the beginning, with us and our stakeholders. We're going to have a little bit more certainty on our project costs as it's going through the prioritization and programming process. Again, trying to eliminate some designs that may not work, with what level we're trying to accomplish here in our goals. And then, of course, we're going to identify that most cost-effective project strategy. So this is just a summary slide of, kind of the benefits of going through the stage one and then project initiation before we move into stage two. Certainly, we're going to have a better defined project scope. Again, we've identified this need, that's an issue here, but we're trying to get a better scope of, well, what are we going to do to try to address this? Since we're going to be honing in on that and some preliminary costs to help with our, as we go through the prioritization process. we can start developing a project timeline. And I don't mean like schedule, but what are you gonna need? What milestones are needed for this project? Make sure we're not missing anything. We're trying to line those up. Again, jump starting on that environmental planning process so that they're not starting from scratch when you have to do your, your NEPA document for, get that done. You're not starting from scratch. We're getting some of that initial information and data. And then that more documented project detail for future prioritization. So we all know that every project doesn't make it into the STIP from the first round. So a lot of times it'll compete, maybe it has to recompete, maybe it didn't get funded, it's going to go through prioritization again. So if we've got some of this information, better scope, better cost estimates, that's really going to help inform us more as we go take that project through prioritization again in that next round. So that was mine, Fast and Furious, and Jennifer and John is going to take you through stage 2.
Okay, so we're gonna put this Highway 101 on the expressway here. Okay, so basically this slide is a high level of the goals of stage 2 alignment defined. It's really a continuation of what Lee just discussed. I'm not gonna go through this because we're gonna take a deep dive as we go through each slide. So at the beginning of stage 2, we put together what we call our project delivery team. And we coordinate to work and review the information that we just talked about in stage 1. We revisit those decisions and review that information. Then the team really starts to work to define the purpose and objectives of the project and the deficiencies that this project needs to address. And these discussions then work to put together what we call a project scope. And then the team turns to the schedule and start to refine those major milestones. So the list you see there is what we call our major milestones. And we need to ensure that they align with fiscal programming and our prioritization. And we have to consider the amount of time that will be given for design activities, all that whole colorful chart. And then also right-of-way acquisition, utility relocations by others, and think about strategic letting. All right.
So Jennifer just mentioned a stage 2 goal is to finalize our purpose and need and to advance our environmental studies. Those two activities go hand in hand. Our project needs are identified throughout stage 1 or early in stage 2. You heard Lee mention the word need a lot. These are typically the problems we were trying to address for the public, like congestion, safety issues, economic development support, those sorts of things. Does the community need more efficient ways to get from one place to another? Do they just need some turning lanes to allow through traffic to flow more smoothly? So for project purpose, we needed to tell everyone what our purpose is. And regulations require that the purpose is based on those needs that we just talked about. So the identified needs should be based on realistic and defensible needs, and the purpose should be clear and help us establish the range of alternatives that we're going to study. A purpose could be as simple as a single sentence, or it could be several paragraphs or pages. Complex projects. That purpose and range of alternatives sets our baseline for what types of environmental studies we have to pursue. Some alternatives will require more complex studies. For instance, a new location roadway could entirely change a community that it passes through. So that requires much more detailed analyses. Our environmental studies are heavily driven by state and federal regulations that we have to adhere to as well. So regulations like the Endangered Species Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, they have very stringent requirements depending on the types of improvements that we're trying to make in our corridors. So there are a lot of pieces that bring together that we bring together to drive our decision making. Our needs and our purpose help us determine what alternative or multiple alternatives we're going to consider that meet those needs. If we need a new highway, there may be at least 3 or 4 different ways to draw that line on a map, right? So from there, we analyze the impacts of those alternatives in comparison with how those alternatives meet our needs. Is one alternative going to affect a historic site more than another? Are they going to affect a river or watershed? How about neighborhoods and communities? All of those impacts matter. And what do we do to mitigate those impacts? We also have to notify everyone. A big part of what we do is to tell everyone what we're thinking about doing here. So from the regulatory agencies to the folks who live along the corridor, They all need to be consulted to help us make well-informed decisions. In doing that, we have to show our work, and that's where our environmental documents come into play. Our environmental documents help us tell the story of the project. They document the process that we followed in considering these environmental impacts, and they notify the public and agencies about our process and our decisions. These environmental documents are a primary mechanism for public participation in our decision-making, and they help us defend our decisions if and when we get questioned later on. And keep in mind, our documents, they're not a permit for construction clearance. They aren't a free pass that we just file away. They're more than that. So I mentioned coordinating with stakeholders earlier. That's a big part of how we get to a good project decision. There are a lot of important parties that we work with. Some are by choice and some are required in our regulations. All of them play a role in helping us define our constraints as well as our opportunities. For instance, we regularly consult with our state's Wildlife Resources Commission to help determine what we can integrate into our projects that benefit wildlife, but also how we can minimize negative impacts to wildlife. Some of this coordination results in commitments that we make to our stakeholders, which we make note of and carry through into final design and into construction. As an example, if we have an adverse effect to a historic building, we may have to make a commitment to provide some extra research on that building in order to mitigate for those effects. Our stakeholder engagement also applies to our complete streets policy, which has goals to reduce pedestrian crashes and unsafe conditions and to improve access and mobility for those without a vehicle. Complete streets policy requires that we evaluate all projects for bicycle and pedestrian needs and include project enhancements to address those needs based on demand, available connectivity, and local government coordination. The project team engages in local conversations and then performs a detailed analysis of existing and planned conditions. Based on all that, engineering judgments used to determine the appropriate facility to meet those needs with consideration of costs and impacts, of course. And we can also update those recommendations later on if we need to.
So in addition, as we're working through stage 2, we really start to look at the risks of the project as well as opportunities for constructability. And we look at maintenance of traffic. So risks are identified as uncertainties that are both can be threats and opportunities. The PDN incorporates risk management, and it's a proactive approach that we use to minimize potential obstacles and to maximize the ability to capitalize on opportunities. In stage 2, again, we're looking at constructability and we're looking at the maintenance of traffic. And so those discussions allow the team to assess construction impacts early on. Project teams plan for how traffic, including motorists, pedestrians, and cyclists, can be safely maintained during construction. And traditionally, that's something that we've always done as we develop projects, but the PDN has really made it to where we bring those items forward earlier and we talk about them more often. Okay, so also in stage 2, we really focus on developing the design recommendation plan set, or we lovingly call it DERPS. So DERPS defines the typical section and it sets the vertical and horizontal alignments of the project. Defining those alignments provides project data that is incorporated into the environmental documentation that John just talked about. And it can also serve as a visual aid when we meet with the public during public engagements. The DERPS is reviewed to ensure that the pedestrian, bicycle, and public transportation aspects are appropriate and that we've made provisions for those in our project and that it aligns with the complete street policy that John just talked about. Once we have those set alignments, that provides the foundation for coordination activities with other technical disciplines. And the reason we have 2 of us here is because in stage 2, we don't ever work alone. It takes a team of us. And so we work with other units as we start technical studies that might include like noise studies and hydraulics, erosion. And so that coordination between those disciplines is also required as we properly establish right-of-way and easement lines. Those are needed for construction. We have to consider maintenance of traffic, and also we have to consider what we might need for utility relocations. So we also are looking at our cost estimates, and the cost estimates Lee talked about in stage one. We're refining those as we get better design information. And we're also looking at agreements and estimates as we're having betterment discussions with municipalities or third-party owners. And this would be an appropriate time for those conversations to be made and those aspects to be incorporated into our DERPs. So after completion of the design recommendation plan set, the team starts really working toward a field inspection and assembling what we call a right-of-way plan set, which you'll hear more about next time. The team must keep those stage 3 goals of right-of-way, utility by others, and permitting in mind as they're coordinating. We have to make access decisions. I talked about typical section. All those design decisions that we make in stage 2 will determine the level of right-of-way impacts that we have. And so we have to be thinking about that as we're designing. We also have a utility kickoff meeting in stage 2, which allows us to share our designs with utility owners. And we start that heavy coordination between what we're proposing versus what they might have or what they might want. So that's occurring. And then we're also having conversations about permitting activities, and we're looking at the impacts, and then we're going ahead and talking about our permitting strategies, and we're starting to assemble permitting applications, possibly. So just have a brief slide here about things that you might want to consider for success in stage 2. And so when discussing the project, communicate the purpose and need, as we've talked about, and the transportation deficiencies that the project is going to address. That's a really easy way to communicate the project to people. Project development is dynamic, and it has current conditions often change, and issues are rapidly coming up. And so it's just good to remember that this is a very dynamic process. And it can take time. Rome wasn't built in a night, so in a day. Project development can take time, and conversations and decisions that are made early on sometimes are difficult to remember, so proper documentation is key. And lastly, focus on the project's needs and the desired outcomes. And really, if you think about it, leaving no stone unturned in stage 2 would help to ensure no surprises later in the life of the project. Back to you, Mark.
I recognize that seemed very long, but we've compressed years into about 40 minutes. So, give us some kudos there. What I'll share here, I won't go into the details of as we've wrapped up, you've heard it. But what I'll give you to look ahead to next month is we'll be discussing how we finalize major design tasks, complete right-of-way acquisition, continue utility coordination and utility relocation, secure environmental permits, and finalize plans to prepare for that contract advertisement. So with that, we can take questions if time allows.
All right, I'm gonna try to get this train back on track. We've given you a lot of information. What I would encourage you to do is study it. If you've got something you're just dying to ask right now, I'll take it. But this is gonna be like our STIP education process. It's gonna be a gradual thing. Probably gonna repeat some things for you just so that you catch it. But I would highlight a couple things for you. One, I love, you didn't get to the best slide, actually. Oh, you took a slide out. Where's the Rome wasn't built in a day? Okay, there we go. That's the Rome wasn't built in a day there. Joey, when we went to that first slide, that was the big graph. Joey leaned over to me and he said, when you look at that, he says, your question is not why does it take so long to build things? It's how do we even build them at all? So it is a remarkable process. I would point out to y'all one thing that I think is under noted in here, and that was the transportation plans up at the beginning, the comprehensive transportation plans are usually done at county level. You approve those. Those are an item T, every month. We don't have any this month, but I obviously don't have any idea of what the Nash County comprehensive plan should be, but I want Melvin to look at it and I want his DE to look at it, because I will tell you from personal experience, those things are not connected to reality a lot. They are lines on a map that some planner comes up with. And I'll give you an example, right? Archer's gonna laugh here, but we recently had the other day, Guilford County had a access road along the interstate, a future access road that ran down a street of a single family neighborhood. So I'm like, you're gonna put tractor trailers down a single family neighborhood street? That doesn't seem like a good plan. So look at those, your Ds, your district engineers, your board members, when they come up, make sure they're grounded in reality. That would be my advice there. And that's a role we can play as well. All right. So if you could, normally take about a 15-minute break. Do what you need to do to get to your next committee meeting, but get there as quickly as you can so we can get started and get back on track, because I do want you to be able to go to dinner tonight. So thank you.